Greg asked me to make his class for him this morning. I have appreciated and enjoyed Greg's class. I think he does an excellent job as we've been going through the scriptures together, and I hope to be able to fill in for him a little bit while he's gone. We're in James chapter 5. I can't help reading chapter 5 without going back to chapter 2. And in what was the main problem that they had in chapter 2 in dealing with one another? You remember? What would they do with the rich? How would they treat the rich? Tom?
Give them better places in
Yeah.
meeting area. They give them better attention. They sort of neglect those that weren't sort of meeting their lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. They would.
A lot of dissension going on.
Right. And I appreciate Joel's prayer this morning because the church is a family. And are these Christians acting like a family? If they are, it's a dysfunctional family. Because he starts out, and I'll go ahead and read the first 6 verses. Now come you rich, weep, and how... I tell you what, let me go back and kind of get the backdrop behind these verses. Look at chapter 4 and verse 13. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we shall do such and such a city, or go to such and such a city and spend a year there and exchange in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does it not, to him it is sin. And so he comes and encourages them to put God in their life and to put God first in their life and not their own selves, not their own wishes, their own desires. Instead of saying, I'm going to go to, tomorrow I'm going to Ohio. I've got to be with my son. He's got some difficulties and I'm going to have to go there and try and help him out for a little while. And so I should say, instead of I'm going to Ohio tomorrow, if the Lord wills, I will go to Ohio. Putting God first in our lives is how he ends chapter 4. Does everybody do that? We're coming into chapter 5, where he begins talking about people who do not do that, who do not put God first in their life, but they are their own strength. They're their own resource. Come now, verse 1, chapter 5. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Behold, the pay of the laborer who mows your fields and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting had reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and have led a wanton life of wanton pleasure, and you have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man, and he does not resist you. So they had some problems with dealing with interpersonal relationships. In this particular one, the rich were oppressing the poor, brethren. And what is he saying here that it's wrong to be rich? What was their problem with the riches here? Tom? Yeah. It was, that's where their treasure was. I think verse 3, although verse 3 I think he's kind of using a play on words here, but verse 3, it is the last days that you've stored up your treasure. That's, their riches were their treasure. And so they were, instead of having spiritual riches, instead of having God be their treasure, silver and gold was their treasure. And what does James say that their silver and gold have done? Corroded. Does silver and gold rust or corrode? No. So he's not being literal in this. I think he's saying the things that you have trusted are temporary, worthless as far as the grand scheme of things are concerned. As far as eternity is concerned, you're going to be able to take it with you? No. The riches that they were counting on, the riches that their heart was in, is something that's temporary, it's something that's temporal, and that's the emphasis I think that he's putting on here. And he says, when you do that, you rich weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments have become moth-eaten. And garments were a source of treasure. They had, you couldn't go to Walmart or Belk's or Best Buy or wherever. Best Buy didn't sell clothes, but wherever you buy your clothes from shows you how much clothes shopping I've done. But you can't go to the store back in this time and just buy clothes. They had to be handmade. They had to be made by somebody. And so it was a very wealthy thing to have 10,000 garments or thousands of garments. And that was part of their wealth. And what would happen with the trust in those garments as an example? Yeah, the moths would eat them up. They would, again, be like the silver and gold. And, say again. Thought I heard somebody.
Tom? Looking at that concept, you go back, reading the story of Samson, he made a wager with the Philistines about garments and things.
Yeah.
Then you see, when Christ was crucified, they cast lots. His robe, they divided his garments among them. That was the way that a lot of soldiers were paid and things, especially those that did the crucifixions. They worked with that and did various things. So when you look at that, then you look at the book of Acts, the concept of those Grecian widows that were being neglected. There was a problem with the church in early times. But then you have that story of Ananias and Sapphira, which is sort of a real picture of what was really going on here. They put their trust in the riches and wanting that instead of doing what others had been doing.
Yeah. And he makes a interesting statement in verse 3. And he says, their rust, talking about the silver and gold and all that, their riches, their rust will be a witness against you. How is the rust of gold and silver going to be a witness against them? When is he talking about this witness taking place? Tom? Since you're the only name I know, I can call you by name. If I just point to you, don't be insulted I don't know your name. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
So basically, just talking about the last judgment.
Yeah.
There's talk. I think here earlier on in James, he talked about these trying times and things that be held against those individuals. Paul, along his letters, goes through and talks about that as well. Don't lay up your treasures here on earth. But Paul was James is sort of, drawing into a focal point right here in this time.
Right. John?
We think about this, what I would relate to with this, the rust is a witness against them. When we have something that rusts, it's typically from a lack of care. I think of my guns, if I don't take them out and clean them from time to time, and I just set them back, they're going to rust from lack of care. The clothes is talking about the moths have eaten them. There's preventive things we can do to keep moths out of our clothes. We think of cedar chest and mothballs. So I think of this when I look at this, they're not taking care of their spiritual beings while here on this earth. They're letting corruption come in and take over from lack of, and we can do this today. Corruption can come in and take over us from lack of spiritual care for ourselves without reading and studying and meditating on the word, prayer, worship. We can be corrupted just like this right here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. 2 Corinthians 5:10, we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an answer to the deeds done in the body, whether they're good or bad. And at the judgment, I think this is the judgment that he's talking about here, that their reliance upon their gold, their silver, and their earthly wealth, the things of this life, are going to be a witness against him in the day of judgment. This is where your heart was, pointing to the gold and silver and the clothes and all that. Yes, sir.
American Pictures, go somewhere and this person's got thousands of things. It's all covered in dust.
Yeah.
They're end of life and they can pick up one little thing and say, "Would you sell us it?" No, I can't.
Yeah.
So that's where they put their heart.
Yeah, their heart's in it. Yeah. So their love of their riches. I think there's in verse 3, there is if not a play on words, a dual meaning of in the last days you have stored up your treasure. It reminds me of Romans chapter 2. Turn over there to Romans chapter 2. And verse 3, and do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment upon those who practice such things, you do the same things yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? So the context is escaping the judgment of God. Or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing the kindness of God leads you to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath. And that's what these people were doing. They were storing up wrath. They thought they were storing up treasure. They thought they were storing up some valuable things. And in this life, I suppose, if that's all you're concerned about, there would be some value in there. But how permanent is that? It's not permanent at all. It's very passing. You're storing up wrath for yourselves in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. And so that's what these people were doing. The contrast here between the physical and the spiritual is physically you're laying up your treasure. This is where your heart is. But spiritually, you're just storing up wrath. You're just laying up for yourselves wrath in the day of judgment. And so the second problem, are any questions about the first three before we go on to the second problem the rich had? Tom?
Well, he's not really going through, he's not saying it's wrong to plan for the future, but when that plan is your primary focus, you've neglected all these other things.
Right.
Because we have other places that, Bible talks about providing for your family, taking care of them, things like that. So, and that's just as bad as, laying up treasures, physical treasures here on earth and having that as your focal goal.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when you do that, you're neglecting the other part as well.
Yeah. Yeah, he's not saying it's wrong to have riches. Some of the richest men that you know about were men of the Bible. Job was the richest man in all the East during his time. Abraham was an exceedingly rich man. Solomon, David was a rich man. And after David had sinned and God talked about how he had blessed him, and it says, and if this wasn't enough, I would have given you more. Solomon was a rich man. And so we see all of these had issues, had problems, sometimes with their wealth. But wealth itself is not the issue, is not the wrong thing. The wrong thing is what we're seeing now in verses 4 through 6, how they use their wealth. What did they do with the laborers that would work in their fields and harvest their crops?
Lied and cheated to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why a lot of, you see a lot of rich people today, maybe even, even some people in Washington, they
Even
get
people
rich.
in Washington.
They get rich because they lie.
Yeah.
And cheat.
Yeah. And I'll give you so much. I'm sure there was an arrangement that they would make, and you harvest my crops and I'll do this. Or possibly they were even servants who had to do what they were expected to do. But he says, you pay, behold, the laborers who mold your field and which are withheld by you. So evidently there was some kind of agreement that was made. I'll pay you for X number of dollars or X number of whatever for X number of work, and yet they withheld the pay that they would get. They cheated them, lied to them and cheated them. And so how they, you clear your throat. Yeah, you clear your throat in this class and I'm going to call on you. And don't scratch your face, because you do, I think you're raising your hand. So they treated their employees pretty badly. And that's part of the problem. They trusted so much, they loved so much of their wealth and their riches that they wouldn't part with them even to pay their employees that were working for them. And so that should be a little, make us contemplate how we treat those who are our employees or who are working for us, or how we ought to behave when we're working for somebody else. Because I don't care who you are, you're working for somebody. I don't care if you're CEO of a mega enterprise. The customers that you have, that's who you're working for. So
Sort of interesting when, in our modern times, a lot of the worldly people have gone through and sort of take a spin on this.
yeah.
They look at, those out there that are wealthy, and we're looking at what they call wealth distribution programs for that wealth. If you're making $1 million, why aren't you paying your employee X number of dollars?
Yeah.
And if they're taking this context out of this, the person agreed to work for that. If he's not agreeing to work for that, then he has the opportunity to go someplace else. A lot of people try to indicate, well, they don't really have someplace else to go.
Yeah.
So it's a turn on what's being said here, but I'm just curious whether there's a lot of the world that people are doing this passage in James and trying to make application, dividing the wealth distribution of the wealthy. I mean, there's some people out there that make a lot of money, and some people that work for them probably don't make a lot, but that's what that position pays, and people have a comprehension, don't have a comprehension to understand that.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hinging off what Tom said, is that you can say that their focus is wrong on both sides of that equation. The focus is on the riches, it's on the wealth, it's on the how much can I have as a quote unquote wealthy person, or how much can I get from this wealthy person. It's all about
that's where we were in chapter 4, the closing of chapter 4. God first, and then we come to people who are not doing that, who are not putting God.
The
Yes.
distinction being made here is in verse 4 that they do it out of fraud.
Yeah.
They're purposely being deceitful and defrauding their employees.
Yeah, why is that?
The greed.
Yeah, because of greed. They love their money. I mean, they love, and that's where their heart is. First 3 verses of this, that's where the heart is. And then how they misuse their funds are given these last 4 through 6, these last verses. And who does their cry? Who cries out? Say again?
The laborers.
The laborers. And who do they cry to? To whom do they cry? To God. The Lord of Sabaoth. What does that mean? Lord of hosts. And I like to, and this is used a lot in the Revelation. And I like the definition that I read one time of what hosts were. It is the Lord of hosts. It is God who is the head of all armies, both in heaven and on earth. The Lord of hosts. And so their cry, the cry of those who are oppressed, reach the Lord who is the commander of all armies of heaven and earth. Yes, sir. Oh, I thought I saw you. And in verse 5, they had lived, how did they live? Luxuriously. Is there anything wrong with having nice things? He's not saying that's the problem. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure, and you have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. I'm not sure what this day of slaughter is. Could be one of 2 things, maybe both. James was written the early part, I believe, of 60, 62, somewhere around there. When did the fall of Jerusalem occur? 70 AD. And so he could be talking about the day of slaughter being when God comes in judgment of the Jewish nation and destroys Jerusalem. Or it could be he's talking about the final judgment, or it could be both. The day of slaughter, because they have, as we saw in Romans chapter 2, they've disregarded the riches of God and counted on their own riches. And so as a result, they're simply storing up wrath. And you store up wrath against the God of the armies of all of heaven and earth. And that's significant. Yes, sir.
Number of people out there scattered and stuff, hogs, other things to take the market. Well, they fatten them up before they take them.
Yeah.
If you look at, the prodigal son, the father killed the fatted calf. It was being prepared for slaughter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of the concept that is being presented here by James. You want to put your trace to that? You're just preparing yourself for going to the slaughterhouse.
Yeah, instead of having the farmer prepare the cattle for slaughter, they were preparing themselves. That's right.
So it's a good analogy there.
Yeah.
Also, you look back at in the Old Testament, and Jesus condemned the Pharisees and those that were rich. They'd gone into a practice of hoarding, which parallels what we're talking about here. They had the riches, and they said, "Oh, we gave it to God," but they were still living on it, and they weren't taking care of their mother and father or others that needed to chase up. So, it wasn't just a problem with these Christians he's talking about. This has been sort of a problem in humanity down through. People look for ways to not do things that they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. In contrast to the real problem, I think, that shows what they were doing wrong in verse 5 is verse 6. You've lived luxuriously, yet you've condemned and put to death the righteous man, and he does not resist you. They have lived in such a way that everything is for themselves, not living with God in mind, not living with their brethren in mind, not living to take care of each other as a family unit should. They're simply looking for out for their own selves, And when you do that, You're just living a life that leads to slaughter. Yes, sir.
I think verse 5 tells us the root of the problem, though, as Tom was saying, with fattening cattle, those of us that do that, verse 5 says, you have lived on the earth, pleasure and luxury, you have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. When we fatten cattle, when I fatten a cow or Richard or any of us that do it, we give that animal everything it could possibly want to eat, drink. I mean, it wants for nothing. They have done that with themselves, but the root problem is their hearts. Their heart is not with God.
Yeah.
And until they change that problem, and us, Dave, our heart's not with God until we change that, until we fix that problem. Like we said, it's not wrong to have things. It's not wrong to be rich. But when your heart is not with God, then it's just like the rich young ruler. His heart was with his riches when Jesus told him to give all he had away to the poor and to follow him. He couldn't do it because his heart wasn't in the right place. He fattened his heart with luxury and pleasure of the world.
Yeah. And I think it's exactly right. What does, yes, sir.
Just thinking, one about dealing with money, the verse that's always impressed me was Ephesians 4:28. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather than labor, work with his hand what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. So he's saying, go get a job so you can give it all away. And
Yeah.
I think that's very impressive.
Well, not just give it all away. You've got the one who doesn't take care of his own family is worse than an unbeliever. But yeah, take care of your family, and then God gives you excess to be able to help somebody else, to be able to help especially your brethren. And these people were not doing that. They were just living luxurious lives, and as a result, they would condemn and put to death the righteous man. Now, why would the righteous man not resist them? He says, kill the righteous man and he does not resist you. What's the concept there? Why does he not resist them? Well, the rich and powerful, if you were in a contest with, pick whoever rich and powerful person you might want to present yourself to, would you have much of a chance in fighting against them if they treated you wrong? Would you have any power to do that? No, and how does the oppressed feel? The oppressed feel like, why should I even try? There's nothing I can do to make this right. He's just going to, as it says here, condemn and put to death the righteous man. He's just going to make it worse for me. Yes, sir.
Kind of like when the IRS sends you a bill.
Say again?
Like when the IRS.
Oh, yeah. Try to withstand them. Yeah, I got a letter from the IRS one time saying I owed $670,000 to the IRS. At one time I was trading, I was doing stock trading and working in that field. And they looked at what I had brought in, but they didn't look at what I paid out, what I paid those stocks, what I bought those stocks for. They just considered, I had them and sold them. And it turns out I lost money. I wasn't making any money, which is why I'm no longer trading. But yes, Tom.
There was a series as well, on public television or whatever, about the leaders that Rockefeller and Carnegie and Edison and Ford, about their rise to fame and their monies and things. And a lot of the undertone in there, they didn't care who they had to step on to get to the top.
Yeah.
In that. And one of their sort of goals were, I think it was, wasn't Carnegie, but one of the other guys, his goal was to be the richest man in the world. And so Rockefeller asked him, well, what would you take for your company? And he came up with a number, and Rockefeller said, okay, I'll pay it. And for a brief moment, he was the richest man in the world. But then Rockefeller surpassed him in a short time.
Yeah.
But that was his whole goal, was to be rich in any way that he could go there and get it. And he thought, well, if he pays me that, I'll be rich.
Yeah, yeah. And it just goes to show the fleetingness of earthly things compared to heavenly things. And then in verses 7 through 11, 11 or 12, he now shifts focus off of the rich, and who does he focus on now in verse 7? Starts out with a, be patient, therefore, brethren. Yeah, he's talking about those whom the rich have abused. Be patient, therefore, brethren. He doesn't call them brethren at the beginning of chapter 5 as he's talking to the rich, but he does with these. He has some association with these. He doesn't have anything in common with these people. With these he has something in common. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the farmer waits, as Tom was talking about the farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, and it gets the early and latter rains. You too be patient, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. Does that sound like a threat? The judge is standing. Behold, do not complain, brethren, one against another, because you know the judge hears you. He's right outside the door. A veiled threat, anyway. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we count these blessed who endured. And you have heard of the patience or endurance, rather, of Job, and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealing with, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. And then he says, above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. So there are several warnings that are issued here to the brethren that are being persecuted by either the rich. I don't know if it's the rich of the world or the rich that's among them. It seems like it's the rich that's among them that have a problem with the poor brethren. But the exhortation that he gives them is be patient. Macrothumeo, long and dealing with heat. Be patient, be long enduring as you undergo provocation. How long is there patience to endure? Yes, sir.
As long as life is on their body.
Yeah.
We have an obligation to be patient. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know how long our trials or tribulations and difficult times are going to be. But however long they are, it's relatively short compared to eternity. So as long as we're alive, we need to be patient and endure and bear up under the temptations that we have and be faithful so that we can have that home in heaven.
Yeah. Be patient until the coming of the Lord, all the way to the end.
That sort of puts it into perspective, not just to those brethren he's writing to, but down through the centuries and even into the future until the Lord does come.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just writing these individuals. Otherwise, then, the Lord's coming, we're already past it. So,
Yeah.
It's a future, present type of situation. It's always there for us.
Yeah, it's not only to us, but also to them, those that were persecuting their brethren, that were mistreating their brethren. But it falls all the way down to us until the coming of the Lord. And
The book of Revelation, the whole book of Revelation, is there talking about that concept of, stay faithful to the end.
Yeah.
And God wins. There's no doubt about it. It's just whether it's our perspective on looking to the Lord and having faith in His promises to us.
yeah. And what's the first example he gives of being patient? the farmer, right? The farmer. Behold, the farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it, and till he gets the early rain and the latter rain. So not only does the farmer, when he goes out, have to break the field, he has to break the field, then wait a little while, and then he goes and plows the field, and then he goes and plants the field, and then he waits on God to do his part, giving the earlier rains and then the latter rains. We used to raise watermelons, and if we got the early rains, it would help the watermelon vines to grow, but if we didn't get the latter rains, it wouldn't make the watermelon sweet. The watermelons just wouldn't be nearly as good as if it got the latter rains. And so the farmer waits for these early rains, he waits for the latter rains, he weeds the crop, he does everything, and then finally, at the end of the season, 8 or 9 months later, or whatever it is, 4 or 5 months later, he gets the produce. So he uses the farmer as an example of being patient. And endure what you're enduring for now, right? It's not going to last much longer. Not only is God coming in judgment of the nation of Israel very shortly, but we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And so he says, you too be patient. And that applies all the way to us. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts. I know you're undergoing trouble. I know you're undergoing persecution, but just be patient. Strengthen your hearts. Why? What is near at hand? The coming of the Lord. The coming of the Lord is near at hand. And that's how we should live our lives, right? We should live our lives as if does James have a timetable on when the Lord's going to come again? No. Neither do we. And so James is not acting or not speaking out of any prophetic knowledge that he has. He is just saying, you live your life as if the day of the Lord is near. And how are they to treat one another? Verse 9. How are they to treat one another in this association that they have? This is tough. If we're persecuted, if we're feeling neglected or feeling beaten up, what's the first thing we do? We complain about those who are persecuting or beating us up. And so he says in verse 9, do not complain, brethren, one against another, that you yourselves might not be judged. And we talked about complaining in the previous chapters, the issue and the problem with complaining. And so he says, don't complain against your brothers lest you be judged, because the judge is right outside the door. The judge is right there. And you're going to be judged. And so don't, even though you're mistreated, even though you're persecuted, don't complain about each other. Don't complain about your brother. Endure patiently, wait till the end, and God will sort everything out. God is going to sort, God is a whole lot better at punishing those who have afflicted me than I am. And so that's his exhortation. Do not complain, brethren, one against another. And that's why I think the rich are part of their brethren. That you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is near, standing at the door. Now, who's the next example that he gives of suffering, enduring suffering, and then being patient, even while they're suffering? Verse 10, the prophets, right? The prophets. And he said, as an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we count those blessed who endure. We don't think much of a prophet who kind of falls away under provocation, under duress. he kind of quits the Lord. But those who endure, we count them blessed. And you have heard of the endurance of whom? Job. You've heard of the endurance of Job. Now, Job was mistreated. And the thinking of that day and time, much like some of us have this same kind of thinking. Whenever somebody has things that seem to be falling their way, what do we always say about them? They must be living right. They must be living right because everything is going their way. They must be living right. And that was the concept in the day of Job, that if you were righteous and if you were godly, that God would prosper you physically. And Job had all of his wealth, and he was the richest man of the East. And so God was just blessing him. And so Satan comes along, and this gives us insight into how Satan deals with all of us. And he says, yeah, he's just serving you for what he can get out of it. But you touch what he's got, and he'll curse you to your face. And so Job is just has everything lost. Has 10 kids that die in one day. All of his cattle, all of his produce, everything. He loses everything. And yet Job does not curse God. And so Satan comes back to God again and says, yeah, touch his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. Skin for skin. And so God allows him to have his flesh touched. But in Job's chapters 1 and 2, it's not Satan that comes and brings Job up initially. It's God. Satan comes before God, and God says, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him in all the earth. A righteous man. And then you have the temptation. The God allows Job to be tested. And the same thing in chapter 2. Have you considered my servant Job? Yeah, touch his flesh, and he'll curse you. So all of that shows how much confidence God had in Job to be faithful. You ever think about us? The things that we endure? The behind the scenes we can't see, just like Job couldn't see. But behind the scenes we can't see, and it could be that God is setting Satan up for failure using us as an example. Have you considered Tom? Man, he's a good guy. You're not going to make him falter. And then all these things come upon him. But God has such confidence in him that he sets Satan up for failure. And that's the example of Job. Yes, sir.
The thing about Job is we was talking about patience a few minutes ago and how long it all takes. When this first round and all that started with Job, he didn't know how long it was going to be. And then another even seemingly worse round starts. And we don't know how long all of that lasted. Yeah. But apparently it went on for a good bit of time. And so Job had to be patient and enduring and hoping that sooner or later this is going to be over. But nevertheless, all the way through it tells us he never sinned with his lips. He didn't sin throughout this. And so we've got to have that same understanding. When we're going through our difficult times, are they going to last a long time or a short time? We don't know. But just like Job didn't know, our obligation is still to be faithful to God.
Yeah. And not only did he not know how long it was going to last, he didn't know why it was happening.
It never did.
Yeah, never did, as far as we know. And yet, at the end, what happened? God blessed him even more than he had before. And so, the endurance of Job, and you see the outcome of the Lord's dealing. And if you want to know the outcome, look at chapter 42 in Job and on through. And it tells how that he had, has the bell rung? Yes. Okay. So that takes us up to verse 12. So I appreciate your comments and your input into the class. And next week, I'll let Greg finish up this chapter. Thank you.